Hi everyone, my name is Moni.
And I'm Naveen from Before You Play.
And today we're going to be previewing a game that is currently on Kickstarter called Ynaros Fallin.
This game is designed by Tomasello as well as Luca Sanfilippo and published by Peekwik Dreams, who are helping sponsor this video. This game is a dueling style competitive game where players are going to be using their followers and shamans to try to control different magical lands, gain different crystals, as well as beat the opponent in battle to ultimately gain the most amount of experience points.
That's right. This is a dueling style game that is set in a fantasy world. And so the game plays 1, 2, or 4 players in a team game. And it also features 3 different levels of difficulty that come with a core box. Now the campaign also features an expansion that includes 2 additional levels of difficulty, as well as a solo campaign for all you solo players out there. And so for more information regarding the game, we've included a link to their campaign down below.
And we do have to mention this is a prototype copy of the game, so things are subject to change in the future, so just be aware of that. Lastly, if you like these kind of videos and you want to see more in the future, please consider subscribing.
And with that, we are ready to begin. So if you please direct your attention to the center of the table, we're all set up here for our 2-player game of Ynaros Fallin. Welcome to the dueling ground.
Yes. Now in this game, one player is going to typically sit on this side and the other player on that side, and they're going to kind of come at each other.
That's right. And so for the purposes of this demonstration, we've deconstructed the board slightly. These player boards are usually right behind the hearths where the shamans stand.
Right.
And so just to kind of give you the lay of the land, each player has 2 different types of characters. We have shaman, which have these masks on them. And we also have followers who start in the hut versus a shaman who starts in your hearth. Now, before we continue, we also do want to mention that these pieces are for the deluxe version of the game. The standard version of the game may come with different miniatures.
Different size meeples.
Yes. Now, the main difference between your 2 characters is that your shamans can actually start battle with your opponent by moving into an area where your opponent is.
Right.
And this is important because, like we were mentioning earlier, this is a dueling style game. And so a majority of our points are going to be coming from XP, which are tracked in our XP trackers over here.
Now, before we continue, we do have to mention that this game does come with 3 different levels of difficulty. We're going to start with level 1, which is kind of the foundation and core of the mechanics of the game. And level 2 and 3 will build upon those later.
So then the way that the game works is players are going to be taking turns going back and forth, taking actions, moving around the board, potentially starting battles with each other, conquering these lands to place on our player boards until the game ends. And so at the end of the game, we're going to be scoring points for however much XP we have. We're going to be converting crystals into XP and also scoring points depending on how many lands we've conquered. And so a player's turn consists of 3 different phases, starting with the deeds phase, where the player gets to take 2 actions. And so in this game, there are 4 different types of actions that you can take. You can either take 2 different ones, or you can take the same one twice. Now, the first type of action allows you to draw 5 shadow cards from the shadow deck. Now, at the start of the game, each player starts with 5 cards already in their hand. And shadow cards look like this. They're going to have either a blue player's color, the yellow player, or sometimes a hybrid of both. Now, in level 1, shadow cards are used in 2 main ways. The first way is during battle, which we'll talk about in a second. And the second way is to manipulate your shadow die. And your shadow die is going to be very important when it comes to moving around the board as well as conquering or capturing magic lands. Now, speaking of your shadow die, the next type of action allows you to play these shadow cards to increase the value of your shadow die. Now, each player's shadow die ranges from 2 to 7. When taking this action, each shadow card you discard increases the value by 1 to a max of 7.
Right.
Now, the third type of action allows you to move 1 or more of your characters around the board. So this is where things start to heat up. So each hex on the board is 1 space. And so just so you know, the difference between your hearth and your hut is followers in your hut must move these 3 spaces to get to your hearth before they can enter the main board. And so when taking the move action, the value on your shadow die is how many spaces you get to move, and you can split them up between your various pieces. There's a maximum of 2 figures who can be on any one hex. And so you must obey that at all times. In addition, every time you take the movement action, you must decrease the value of your die by 1. So after taking this action, my 7 is going to go down to a 6. Now, the minimum value that you could have on your die is 2. And so if you ever have a value of 2 on your shadow die, then you don't have to decrease when taking the action. So if I wanted to take the move action and my shadow die is showing a 7, I could spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get here, and then 6, 7 to move my follower closer to my hearth.
Yeah, because this is the way you're going to enter into the battleground.
And after using my movement points, my shadow die would go down to a 6. So it does get slightly depleted.
Yep.
Now that I'm here, by the way, I'm sharing a hex with one of the 3 different colors of crystals that you'll see in the game. We have yellow thunder crystals, green mana crystals, as well as red lava crystals. And so I could choose to collect this in order to spend it later on for different purposes, or I could leave it there because sharing a hex with a crystal offers me some sort of protection against battle.
Yep.
If my opponent moves into the hex that has a crystal on it, they must first discard a crystal of the same color in order to initiate battle. Now, when picking up crystals, they're going to be stored in your reserve on your player board. And so the tops of each of your player boards has space for them. Crystals have multiple purposes, especially during battle, but one of the other main purposes is for the 4th and final action called control. Now, you can only take this action if one of your characters is in a straight line of sight with your opponent. So if it were something like this, or if they were sharing a hex. And so now that we're in line of sight, taking the control action requires you to spend a crystal from your reserve and do an ability depending on what color of crystal you discarded.
Discarding a green mana crystal will allow you to use a magic land of a forest type that belongs to your opponent. Discarding a red lava crystal will allow you to take the value of your opponent's dice and add it to your own, and then take a free movement, which could allow you to conquer another land. And discarding an orange thunder crystal will allow you to take one of the battle dice, roll it, and force your opponent to go back depending on the value. We'll talk about the significance of this track in a little bit.
Yes, but it also weakens them for the battle. And those are the 4 different types of actions that you can take. But remember, you're only taking 2 of them during your turn. And so once you're done with the first phase, you move on to the second phase, which is the fate phase. And this is where you resolve any events depending on if you've moved to any special places on the board. If during phase 1, one of your characters reached a mystic source, then you get to discover magic lands. And so the back of each magic land is going to show a level between 1 and 4, depending on how many circles are filled in. And so in this example, we have 3 level 1s and 1 level 3.
Right.
Now, when discovering magic lands, you must use the value of your shadow die, and you have to use the entire thing to discover as many of them as you can. But you get to decide how to use it.
So in this case, because the shadow die is at a level 3, you could choose to either discover just this one level 3 or all 3 of these single level ones.
Now, it's important to note that these 4 stacks only contain reef and forest type magic lands. The red volcano lands are only found in the center of the board and don't need to be discovered. Regardless of the type, all of the magic lands give the player a specific ability that they can use. But the difference is that reef and forest lands must be captured before they can be utilized, whereas the volcano lands can be used immediately, up to the number of times depending on its tracker. Now, in order to conquer either a forest land or a reef land, you must first meet the requirement shown on the land itself, which is either going to be having a specific value on your shadow die or having a certain number of characters on the board. So for this forest land, I have to have at least 2 characters on the board, just like this. And then during phase 1, I would have had to have moved one of my characters on top of this land. And since I've met its requirement, I get to take this magic land and gain its ability, which is a one-time ability because it's a green one, whereas the reef lands give you a once-per-turn ability that you can use once you've conquered them.
Yeah, so that's more ongoing. This is a one-off.
And there's a wide variety of benefits that these lands can provide, and so the game comes with an appendix so that you can see what's available. But for example, this land allows you to move your shadow die up to 7 and decrease your opponent's die down to 2. So that's sort of a mean one. Now that I've captured this land, it goes onto my player board and it's going to score me 5 XP at the end of the game. In addition, I get a crystal of the land's color. So in this case, I would get a mana crystal.
Right.
And since the land required me to have 2 characters on the board, they both go back to their starting spot, which is the hearth for my shaman and the hut for my follower. As for utilizing the power of volcanic lands, we'll discuss those in phase 3. The next type of event occurs when your shaman enters the hearth of your opponent. This will allow you to evoke a new character, which can now be used to move around the board and will also score you additional points at the end of the game. Now, if your opponent's hearth was empty when entering, all you have to do is discard a magic crystal of the color of your choice. This will allow you to either take a new follower and place them in your hut, or evolve a follower into a shaman. And so if the follower was on the main board when evolving them, they maintain their previous position. Afterwards, the shaman that performed the evocation must go back to their starting spot. Now, if your opponent's hearth was not empty when entering, you must first battle before performing the evocation. However, if you won the battle, then you don't have to discard a crystal in order to perform the evocation. And finally, the last type of event is, of course, going into battle. The looming battle that we've been discussing. Now, it's important to keep in mind that hexes that already contain two of your opponent's characters cannot be battled because each hex can only hold a maximum of 2 characters. But say I'm the blue player and I move my shaman into this hex, I will trigger a battle in phase 2, with me as the attacker and the yellow player as the defender. Now, the way that battle works is starting with the attacker, players are going to be taking turns spending 1 crystal from the reserve or up to 3 shadow cards in order to combine into combat units to attack your opponent. Since I'm the attacker, I'm going to be going first as the blue player. The first time a player chooses to spend a crystal, they get to reserve the battle die of that color for them to roll for that battle. Since I can see that we both have yellow crystals, I'm going to spend 1 crystal to claim the yellow battle die, and I get to roll it. And whatever the value of the battle die is, that is how many spaces you get to move your opponent's battle pawn down their tracker. And so once the battle ends, you're going to gain XP depending on where their battle pawn is along the tracker. Alternatively, you can use that value to recover by moving your battle pawn back up that many spaces. And so now that I've claimed the yellow battle die, my opponent cannot use yellow energy crystals for the rest of the battle. One thing to note is since this is considered an early prototype copy of the game, things have already changed, including some of the faces of the battle dice, which are going to have special faces in the final copy.
Now, at the start of my turn during this battle, I can either spend the red crystal for a red battle die, or I can spend up to 3 shadow cards from my hand. When playing shadow cards, your opponent's cards count as 1 combat unit, your own cards count as 2, and if you're able to play your own color on top in a horizontal fashion, it's going to double everything below it. So in this case, 1 + 2 × 2 for this card.
Which is a total of 6 combat units that you can now choose to either decrease my power or recover your own.
Right.
And that's essentially how battle works. Play would then go to me, where I can choose to either play shadow cards or spend another yellow crystal in order to re-roll my die, until either a player decides to retreat while still having items to play, and in that situation, the retreating player would lose the battle, or until a player runs out of resources. And in that case, the player with the lowest amount of damage wins the battle. Once the battle ends, then players gain XP depending on how much damage they've caused their opponent. And so in this case, the blue player would get 5 XP since the yellow player is at -5, and unfortunately the yellow player doesn't get any.
Nothing.
In addition, the winner gets to take one of the opponent's vital crystals, and these are going to be considered wild when converting our crystals for XP. That'll also gain us additional XP depending on which spot the vital crystal was in. Once the battle is done, then you reset the battle tracker, and the loser of the battle goes back to their place of origin. The winner gets to decide whether they'd like to stay on their hex or return to their place of origin as well. And those are all of the possible events that you're going to be encountering throughout the game. Now, going back to a player's turn, the third phase is the cantrips phase, where you have the option to perform up to 2 of the optional cantrips available. The first cantrip is harnessing, which allows you to gain the benefits of each volcanic land that you control. You first get the bonus depicted on each land, which again are highly variable, and then you decay each land by 1. Each time their tracker reaches 0, you remove the land and reveal a new one.
And the second type of cantrip is called focus. This allows you to convert your crystals into XP. You can place up to 3 crystals into the conversion area, and once it's fully filled, you get to score XP depending on what you've placed in there. Having 2 different colors of crystals will score you 10 XP, all 3 of the same will get you 12, and 1 of each unique type will get you 15. So in this case here, the vital crystal acts as a wild, which would get you 15 XP. After scoring, these crystals are all removed.
And once a player has completed all 3 phases of their turn, then play continues to the next player until one of the 3 game end triggers has been reached. The game ends when either a player fills up all 6 magic land spots on their personal board, or when any 3 magic land piles have been exhausted, regardless of their color. And at that point, players go into endgame scoring. Now, there's also a third way in which the game can end, and that is when a player has lost all of their vital stones. But in this scenario, no endgame scoring takes place because that player automatically loses. Now, when calculating endgame scoring, players first gain XP depending on how many magic lands they've captured, up to a maximum of 40 XP for all 6. They also earn 10 XP for each shaman and 5 XP for each follower. And finally, they gain XP for each conversion of 3 crystals in their reserve. And at that point, whoever has the most XP wins. Now, those are the core mechanics of how you play level 1, which is what level 2 and level 3 are built upon. Level 2 is played the exact same way, but also introduces level 2 magic lands, evocation tokens, which basically provide a one-time use power for the player who acquires it by moving onto the space, as well as shadow tiles, which either speed up or slow down movement depending on the color of the tile placed on the main board. Shadow tiles are put into play by taking the play shadow card's action depending on the color of shadow card you discard. Dark shadow tiles slow down movement by requiring players to spend 2 of movement instead of 1 in order to enter the tile. Colored shadow tiles affect movement depending on the player they belong to. So if I'm placing a blue shadow tile here and I'm the blue player, moving across this tile for me is free, whereas the yellow player cannot move across the tile at all.
It's a barrier.
Now there's also a bicolored tile, which is on the opposite side, and for these tiles, the blue player may move across them freely, whereas the yellow player must spend 2 movement points instead of 1, just like with the dark shadow tiles.
And these tiles can be overbuilt, which is important because at the end of the game, you're going to score 2 XP for each of your colors showing.
And those are essentially the new additions with level 2. Now with level 3, that's when the game gets much wilder. It introduces experience fragments, you have shadow temples, and you also have changes to how the battle mechanic works. And so for details about level 3, as well as the expansion, we encourage you to check out their Kickstarter, which is linked in the description below.
Now, thank you all so much for watching the video. We hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. And again, thank you so much. If you like these kind of videos and you want to see more in the future, please consider subscribing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.